The banquet began at sunset, when the Nile was painted in gold and copper, its surface trembling under the evening breeze. Servants in crisp white linen moved silently through the courtyard, their feet bare against the cool stone, carrying trays laden with delicacies that glittered in the torchlight. The palace smelled of lotus and incense, a sweetness heavy enough to hide what lay beneath it, the rich, damp scent of the river, and something else, something faintly sour, like grain left too long in the sun. Musicians sat cross-legged in the shadows, plucking at harps and strumming long-necked lutes, their songs winding through the warm night air. Women in beaded collars leaned lazily against cushions, laughing behind perfumed hands, while officials and nobles, faces bronzed by the sun, gathered around low tables carved with hieroglyphs. Bronze goblets clinked. Oil lamps flickered, throwing shadows against painted walls where gods with falcon heads and bull horns seemed to lean closer to watch. It was a scene any court poet might have immortalized: gold, beauty, abundance. And yet, for all its splendor, it was also a place where one could die from a single careless bite. On the grandest tray, carried with ceremony by two servants, was the first course, bread. But this was not the soft, airy bread of modern bakeries. These loaves were flat, heavy, and the color of river mud. Their crusts bore a strange sheen, and when broken, the inside revealed a coarse, gritty crumb that scraped against the teeth. The nobles smiled as they tore pieces and dipped them in bowls of honey or thick beer, never mentioning the truth that each bite carried tiny shards of stone, ground into the flour by the very querns that milled it. Over years, those invisible fragments would grind a man's teeth down to stumps, leaving nerves exposed, inviting abscess, infection, and slow death. Yet bread was life here. Every hand at the table, from the pharaohs to the humblest temple scribe, would reach for it without hesitation. It was the first taste a child knew, and for many, the last. Beyond the bread, dishes of meat steamed under flickering torchlight. There was goose, its skin lacquered with honey, the fat pooling in carved alabaster bowls. There was beef, charred on the outside but pink and bleeding within. And beside it, duck legs, glistening with melted fat, their bones laid bare where teeth had torn the flesh. They smelled intoxicating, smoky, rich. But even these came with dangers. Without ice, without any knowledge of microscopic life, meat could spoil before the platter reached the table. In the heat of the Egyptian sun, decay was always waiting, invisible, patient. Honey could mask the taste of rot. Wine could dull the awareness. But the body knew, sooner or later. Beer was poured into tall clay jars, frothy and thick. This was no sparkling amber brew, it was closer to porridge than drink, clouded with yeast and flecks of husk. The pharaoh's cupbearer ladled it into small bowls, offering them with both hands. A sweet, sour smell drifted up as nobles drank, the foam clinging to their lips. Some smiled, flushed with the warmth of alcohol. Others grimaced. The beer could be bitter, unpredictable, sometimes brewed with herbs that dulled pain, or with substances meant to provoke visions. It nourished, yes, but it could also sicken. At the edges of the feast, servants presented smaller dishes, odd shapes glistening in oil, tiny creatures fried until they curled, fish with scales like polished bronze lying on beds of greens. Some fish were sacred, others despised, yet here, on this night, the rules bent in service of luxury. A noble might eat what his priests condemned, simply because it had been caught fresh that morning, or because it was rare enough to prove his wealth. The smell of the feast mingled with the perfume of flowers and the faint, constant aroma of the Nile, muddy, mineral, alive. Every so often, a breath of wind carried the scent of something less pleasant: drying fish in the markets beyond the palace walls, heaps of onions and garlic baking in the sun, or the damp rot of river plants gathered for soup. And still, the eating went on. This was not merely nourishment, it was performance, an assertion of power. In Egypt, to eat richly was to show the gods you lived under their favor. To display variety, meat, beer, bread, sweets, was to say you were not like the workers who survived on a single meal of bread and onions each day. Here, food was currency, status, and magic. Certain dishes were offered to the gods before they ever touched a human tongue, others were consumed in rituals meant to bring fertility, health, or protection from evil spirits. Yet beneath the gold and ceremony lay a truth no musician's song would admit: this abundance could be as deadly as it was beautiful. Parasites swam in the flesh of Nile fish. Bread carried the slow poison of ground stone. Cheese harbored diseases that could cripple a man. Honey preserved sweetness, but also the bodies of the dead. And as the night deepened, as torches burned lower and the last courses arrived, dates stuffed with nuts, figs soaked in palm wine, the guests leaned back on cushions, sated, laughing, toying with gold bracelets. They did not speak of the laborers who had pulled the geese from the riverbank, the fishermen who had risked bilharzia from wading in the shallows, the women who had ground the grain until their hands blistered. Nor did they speak of the priests who, only a few rooms away, prepared offerings of the same foods for the dead, who in turn would eat them in some shadowy afterlife. To be invited here was to be marked as fortunate, perhaps even blessed. But in the silence between songs, in the pause between bites, one might wonder, was this a gift from the gods, or a gamble against them? For in Egypt, a table by the Nile could bring life, or death. Long before the scent of roasting meat or the foam of beer filled an Egyptian home, there was bread. It was the foundation of life here, as essential to the Nile's people as the river itself. Yet, the bread that sustained them was also the slowest, quietest killer in the land. The making of it began with grain, emmer wheat and barley, hauled in great baskets from the fields. The harvest was a celebration, the stalks cut by sickle, bundled, and threshed under the feet of cattle, their hooves stomping out the golden seeds from the chaff. The air would be thick with dust and husks, clinging to hair and skin. From there, the grain went to the grinders. Women hunched for hours over low stone querns, their hands pushing a smaller stone back and forth, over the kernels. The rhythm was hypnotic, but the stones betrayed them. Minute fragments chipped away from the quern's surface, invisible to the eye, but carried into the flour. The flour was never sifted, the grit stayed, blending seamlessly with the pale powder. By the time it was baked into bread, the sand and stone could not be seen, only felt, days or years later, when a mouthful scraped across enamel like a file against glass. Archaeologists have opened the jaws of Egyptian mummies and found teeth ground almost flat, roots exposed. Some skulls bear abscesses so severe that the bone is eaten away, the infection having bored into the jaw during life. Imagine the agony, constant, throbbing pain in a time before painkillers. And yet, no one thought of giving up bread. Bread was not optional, it was survival. It came in many forms: flat loaves, rounded buns, thick rolls stuffed with dates or drizzled with honey. For the poor, it might be little more than a dense, dark cake, baked quickly in clay molds pressed against the walls of an oven. For the wealthy, it could be adorned with seeds, flavored with coriander, or enriched with milk. But the grit was there for all, no matter the rank. The millstones showed no favoritism. The bread itself had a heavy, earthy taste. Made from emmer wheat, it lacked the soft, airy crumb of later wheat breads. The loaves were thick, chewy, sometimes with a sour note from fermentation. Even the best of it could be tiring to chew, especially when every bite wore at the very teeth needed to eat it. Bread was so central to Egyptian life that it became a kind of currency. Laborers were paid in daily rations of bread and beer, their value measured in loaves. Tomb inscriptions recorded how much bread a man could earn in a day's work. The dead, too, required their share. Tombs were stocked with bread offerings, some baked fresh for burial, others modeled from clay or carved in stone as eternal symbols of nourishment. But bread was not always pure. In lean years, when grain was scarce, chaff might be ground into the flour to make it stretch further. In desperate times, crushed beans, lentils, or even papyrus root might be added, ingredients that made the bread heavier, more bitter, and far harder to digest. For the poorest, the bread could be little more than a lump of baked paste, filling the stomach but offering little strength. It was not only teeth that suffered. The grit-laden bread slowly wore down more than enamel. It could also grind the joints of the jaw, inflame the gums, and open the door to infections that spread beyond the mouth. Chronic tooth pain could lead to weight loss, fever, and, in some cases, death. And yet, Egyptians seemed to accept this as the cost of living. Bread was a gift from the gods, a symbol of ma'at, order and balance. It was the offering laid before Osiris, the sustenance of the dead in the field of reeds. To refuse bread was to step outside the flow of life itself. Even in the grand kitchens of the pharaoh, where bread was baked by the dozens in massive ovens, the danger lingered. Servants would knead dough with bare hands, folding in water drawn from the Nile, working the sticky mass on reed mats until it could be shaped. Loaves baked directly on the oven floor or in clay molds, beautifully browned, fragrant, and still hiding their grit. At festivals, bread could be molded into elaborate shapes, birds, fish, flowers, painted with ochre for decoration. Children might delight in these edible sculptures, breaking them apart to find raisins or nuts inside. The first bite might be sweet, but the crunch beneath it was unmistakable. The truth was simple: in ancient Egypt, to live was to eat bread, and to eat bread was to eat stone. Every meal was a quiet wager, your hunger against your teeth, your need for life against the slow grinding of death. And still, when the sun rose over the Nile each morning, the bakers began again, feeding the fires, kneading the dough, shaping the loaves that would fill the bellies of a kingdom. The smell of bread baking drifted over the riverbanks, into the homes of farmers and fishermen, priests and scribes. It was a comfort, a promise. But for those who knew the truth, it was also the faint, warm breath of a killer. If bread was the body of Egyptian life, beer was its blood. No table, no worksite, no temple could do without it. From the grandest banquets in Memphis to the humblest fisherman's hut on the banks of the Nile, beer flowed daily, thick, cloudy, and utterly unlike anything we pour from bottles today. To the ancient Egyptian, beer was not simply a drink, it was nourishment in liquid form, a staple as vital as bread. It was their breakfast, their midday refreshment, and their evening comfort. Children drank it. Pregnant women drank it. Laborers under the blazing sun gulped it down between hauling stones for pyramids. Priests drank it before conducting sacred rites. Even the dead, lying cold in their tombs, were supplied with beer for their eternal journey. And yet, this beer was a strange and unpredictable thing, sometimes healing, sometimes harmful, always alive in ways the Egyptians could not see. The brewing began with bread, dense loaves baked only partially so they stayed moist inside. These were broken apart and crumbled into vats of water drawn from the Nile. The water itself was never entirely pure, it carried silt, plant matter, and whatever the river chose to bring downstream. But to the Egyptians, this was the river's gift, and no one thought to boil it. Instead, the crumbled bread was left to sit in the warmth of the sun, sometimes with dates or honey to encourage fermentation. Within hours, invisible armies of yeast, wild, untamed, began their work, bubbling the mixture into life. The result was a liquid thick with grain pulp, sweet and sour in equal measure, and strong enough to warm the body. It was poured through baskets or cloth to strain out the largest chunks, though much still remained. A sip of this beer was closer to swallowing a thin porridge than drinking a clear brew. The taste depended entirely on luck. Some batches were rich and pleasantly sweet, others sharply sour or bitter. Occasionally, the beer could carry an unpleasant tang, evidence of bacteria thriving alongside the yeast. A poorly cleaned jar could infect the next batch, turning it foul. Yet the Egyptians drank it anyway. To refuse beer was to reject life's comfort. For the worker, beer was payment. A man hauling stone in the sun might receive 2 large jugs a day, each one holding a cloudy, filling drink that provided calories and dulled exhaustion. For the noble, beer was refined, flavored with herbs, honey, or even imported spices. At festivals, beer might be brewed stronger, potent enough to intoxicate after only a few bowls. Such beer could loosen tongues, spark laughter, or lead to staggering dances under the moon, where the line between celebration and chaos blurred. Beer was also medicine, though in ways more mystical than scientific. In temple records, certain brews were prescribed for ailments, mixed with ground herbs or minerals. One remedy for stomach troubles called for beer infused with coriander and juniper berries. Another, far more unsettling, added a small amount of animal blood, a ritual meant to transfer the creature's strength to the drinker. The sacred role of beer was even more profound. It was offered to the gods daily, poured out before statues, or left in tombs for the dead. Some of the oldest surviving jars of beer are not from kitchens but from burial chambers, sealed thousands of years ago with lumps of cloth and mud. Archaeologists who opened them found a sour, yeasty sludge, still faintly smelling of fermentation after millennia. There is an older, darker legend tied to beer, whispered in temple stories. In the myth of Sekhmet, the lion-headed goddess of war, she once sought to destroy humankind in a frenzy of bloodlust. To stop her, the god Ra ordered thousands of jugs of beer to be dyed red and poured out across the land. Thinking it blood, Sekhmet drank deeply until she fell into a drunken sleep, sparing the world. Since then, festivals in her honor were celebrated with excessive drinking, as if to reenact the goddess's dangerous mercy. But beer could harm as easily as it could save. A contaminated batch could bring fever, vomiting, or death. The fermentation process might be halted too soon, leaving a drink that soured quickly in the heat. Even the stronger brews were prone to spoilage. And still, Egyptians took the risk. The alternative, drinking the Nile's raw water, was no safer. In the evening, when the heat eased and the desert wind began to stir, beer was poured into small clay bowls and passed around a circle of friends or family. The drink was shared, the stories flowed, and the day's fatigue dissolved in the warmth of alcohol. And in the silent tombs outside the city, beer offerings waited on stone tables for those who would never lift a bowl again, their vessels sealed and shadowed for eternity. In life and in death, beer bound the Egyptians together. It was the drink that built their monuments, filled their feasts, and, in quiet moments, carried both comfort and danger in every cloudy gulp. The Nile was Egypt's silver ribbon, its flowing heart. It gave grain, it gave life, and it gave fish. In the mornings, before the sun climbed too high, the river would be alive with the calls of fishermen, their small reed boats drifting among the reeds, nets trailing in the dark water. Bronze hooks dangled from woven lines. Spears flashed in the sun as men lunged at a sudden swirl beneath the surface. The catch could feed a village, or, just as easily, bring sickness to it. The Nile teemed with fish, perch, tilapia, catfish, mullet, eels. For many Egyptians, this was their only reliable source of meat. A laborer's midday meal might be little more than bread, onions, and a salted fishtail. Children ran to meet the boats when they docked, grabbing at the smallest fry to roast on sticks over tiny fires. In temple carvings, fish appear again and again, symbols of abundance, of the river's generosity. And yet, the river's generosity came at a price. The Nile's slow, warm waters were a paradise not only for fish but for parasites. Trematodes, roundworms, and the dreaded schistosome thrived here, their larvae waiting unseen in the shallows. A man gutting his catch barefoot in the water might unknowingly invite these invisible guests into his blood. Eating fish raw, or not salted or cooked long enough, could carry the same risk. The Egyptians knew nothing of parasites, but they knew the symptoms: fever, wasting, a strange swelling of the belly, and, in time, death. And still, fish remained essential. Fresh fish was a luxury, eaten close to where it was caught. For most, the catch was preserved, salted, sun-dried, or pickled in brine. This preservation gave it a sharp, pungent smell that clung to the markets, where baskets of the stuff were stacked in pyramids and flies hovered in lazy clouds. In the midday heat, the odor could be overwhelming, the tang of salt and rot mixing with the scent of onions, garlic, and sweat. Some fish were sacred and never eaten. The Oxyrhynchus fish, with its distinctive snout, was revered in certain cities. In others, the Nile perch was avoided. The reasons were partly religious, each town had its patron species, and partly practical. Avoiding a sacred fish was a way of honoring the local gods. But in a neighboring region, the same fish might be dinner. In the temples, fish could play stranger roles. There are records of dried fish placed among offerings to deities, sometimes wrapped in linen as if to mimic the dead. In certain rituals, priests may have consumed fish that was far past fresh, its preservation secondary to its symbolic meaning. Archaeologists have opened jars from tombs to find small fish mummified, their scales still faintly gleaming under layers of resin, as if they were meant to serve as a perpetual meal for the spirit of the deceased. The taste of Nile fish varied wildly. Tilapia, known as the mother fish for the way it carried its young in its mouth, was tender and mild. Catfish, with its oily flesh, could be rich but also carried a muddy undertone from the riverbed. Salted mullet was intensely savory, a flavor that lingered in the mouth for hours. Some fish were stuffed with herbs or onions before roasting, their skins blistered and crackling. Others were simply laid on hot stones until their flesh flaked away from the bones. But not all cooking could disguise spoilage. Fish gone bad had a sour edge, a texture that clung unpleasantly to the teeth. In poorer districts, such fish might still be eaten rather than wasted, especially if the smell could be masked with garlic or spices. Hunger has always been a ruthless persuader. For the wealthy, fish could be exotic. Some species were brought from distant parts of the Nile or even from the Mediterranean coast. These were served whole on polished trays, garnished with figs or pomegranates, their eyes staring glassily up at the diners. In some cases, the fish were prepared with more artistry than safety, flavored delicately but cooked only lightly, a dangerous choice in an age without knowledge of bacteria. Fishermen lived close to this danger every day. They rose before dawn, paddled into the mist, and cast their nets into waters that could give life or take it. They carried talismans against river spirits, muttered prayers to Sobuk, the crocodile god, and sometimes made small offerings, a pinch of grain, a drop of beer, before the day's work began. They had seen too many friends vanish under the water's surface or return to shore sickly, their eyes sunken, their bodies wasting. And yet, when the day ended and the last light gilded the river, families gathered on the bank to roast what had been caught. The smell of fish and smoke rose into the night, mingling with the scent of the reeds. For the Egyptians, the Nile's bounty was worth its risks. It was the taste of home, of survival, of the river itself. But under the calm gleam of moonlight, the water flowed on, dark, slow, and always carrying more than just fish in its depths. In the great courts of Thebes or Memphis, the arrival of meat was a spectacle worthy of trumpets. Servants entered in a line, each bearing a platter heavy with roasted goose, spit-turned lamb, or great slabs of beef still steaming from the fire. The scent of charred fat and spices filled the air, cutting through the sweetness of lotus incense. For the nobility, meat was not an everyday food, it was a statement. A feast. A declaration that the gods themselves had blessed the household with abundance. But in Egypt, meat was never just meat. It was tangled in religion, rank, and superstition. Certain animals were sacred, others were forbidden, and some were only eaten under the shadow of ritual. The most prized flesh came from cattle. Beef was the centerpiece of festival tables, reserved for the wealthy or for offerings to the gods. The choicest cuts were slaughtered and dressed within temple precincts, their blood collected for ceremonial use. Priests would bless the meat before it was sent to the pharaoh's kitchen or to the families of high-ranking officials. Goose and duck were almost as beloved, plump birds fattened on grain and lotus roots, their skin crisped until golden. Sheep and goats were eaten as well, though with less grandeur. And there were pigs, divisive creatures, considered unclean by some and a delicacy by others. In certain parts of Egypt, swineherds were viewed with suspicion, even shunned, while elsewhere roasted pork appeared on banquet tables. The reasoning was rarely purely practical, it was as much about the shifting tides of belief as about taste. Meat was not only a luxury, it was also a time-sensitive danger. In a land where the sun burned from dawn to dusk, meat began to spoil almost as soon as it was slaughtered. Without ice, the Egyptians turned to preservation, salting, sun-drying, smoking, or encasing the cuts in fat. The wealthy sometimes used honey as a sealant, coating meat so thickly in the golden syrup that it excluded air and delayed decay. But honey could only do so much, and after days, or sometimes only hours, raw would creep in, cloaked beneath sweetness. When archaeologists opened certain tombs, they found these preserved meats still wrapped in linen, often blackened with resin. Some, miraculously, retained their shape after thousands of years, others had liquefied into unrecognizable lumps, the stench seeping through even ancient wrappings. These were not merely provisions for the afterlife, they were symbols of status, proof that the deceased had lived richly enough to dine well beyond death. Religious belief dictated much of what could be eaten. Certain animals, such as the ibis or the cat, were sacred to specific gods and never slaughtered for food. Eating them would have been an act of sacrilege, a direct insult to the deity they represented. And yet, there were exceptions in the shadows, occasions when a sacred animal might be consumed as part of an esoteric ritual, its flesh believed to confer divine protection or power. At festivals, meat took on another layer of meaning. The great feast of Opet or the celebrations for the flooding of the Nile might see whole herds of cattle slaughtered in offering, the aroma of roasting flesh drifting over the city for days. In these moments, meat was abundance incarnate, a gift from the gods shared among the people. But even then, the division between classes was stark. The finest cuts went to the priests and nobility, the rest to the workers, tougher meat, gristle, and bones boiled for broth. The preparation of meat was both art and hazard. Skilled cooks seasoned it with garlic, coriander, cumin, and fenugreek, roasting it over open flames or boiling it in large copper pots. Goose might be stuffed with dates, figs, and onions, the juices mingling in a thick, dark sauce. Beef could be sliced thin and grilled quickly, or simmered in beer to tenderize it. But no matter how skillfully cooked, meat could carry unseen dangers, parasites, bacteria, the slow spoilage hidden under spice and fat. Hunters also brought more exotic fare from the marshes and deserts, antelope, gazelle, hare. These were prized for their rarity and often served in the private chambers of the elite, away from the public eye. The taste of gazelle, tender and slightly sweet, was said to be fit for a pharaoh. But here, too, risk lingered. The further the meat traveled, the greater the chance it arrived already tainted. The poorer classes rarely tasted fresh meat. Their share came salted, dried, or in the form of scraps boiled into stew. On feast days, they might receive more, perhaps a slice of goose from a temple offering, or a stringy portion of beef from a communal sacrifice. For them, the taste was less about luxury and more about sustenance, a rare break from the monotony of bread and onions. Meat in ancient Egypt was a bridge between the earthly and the divine. It could elevate a banquet into a holy feast, or it could rot in the dark corners of a kitchen and bring sickness to all who ate it. In the hands of the priests, it was a sacred gift; in the hands of the cook, a fleeting treasure to be savored before the heat claimed it. And always, in the background, was the silent knowledge: in this land, abundance was never without danger. The same platter that proclaimed a pharaoh's glory could also carry the seeds of his undoing. Cheese in ancient Egypt was not the pale, neatly sliced food we know today. It was older, sharper, stranger, born in clay pots and goatskin bags, ripened in the desert heat until it took on a life of its own. It could be a blessing or a curse, a gift for a pharaoh or a hidden killer waiting on a plate. Dairy itself was not new to the Egyptians. Herds of cows, goats, and sheep grazed on the lush floodplains after the Nile's waters receded. Milk was precious, but it spoiled within hours under the sun. To preserve it, people curdled it, intentionally or not, and learned to separate the solid curds from the watery whey. What they produced was somewhere between a fresh cheese and a sour, dense yogurt, often salted to extend its life. But life was a relative term. In the absence of refrigeration, cheese became a gamble. Some batches aged into rich, tangy wheels that could last for weeks. Others soured too quickly, their taste edging from sharp to putrid. The Egyptians could only judge by sight and smell, trusting their senses to catch the point when tang became danger. They did not know that in those curds, invisible bacteria could lie in wait. We know this now because of a discovery in 2018. Archaeologists opening a 3,200-year-old tomb near Saqqara found a broken jar, inside of which was a white, solid mass. Analysis revealed it was cheese, likely made from cows and sheep's milk, and laced with Brucella melitensis, a bacterium that causes brucellosis. The symptoms? Fever, muscle pain, night sweats, and, untreated, death. That ancient cheese had been left as an offering to the tomb's owner, perhaps intended to sustain him in the afterlife. In reality, it might have been the most dangerous thing in his burial chamber. For the living, cheese was both a common food and a mark of refinement. Workers might eat a fresh, crumbly version with bread, its salt cutting through the heaviness of the grain. The wealthy preferred aged cheeses, denser and more flavorful, sometimes infused with herbs or smoked over aromatic wood. A small dish of cheese might appear at the end of a noble's meal, served alongside figs and honey, the sweet masking any bitterness. The smell could be potent. Fresh cheese was mild, almost sweet, but aged varieties could grow pungent enough to command a room. In market stalls, vendors kept their cheeses wrapped in cloth or leaves, both to protect them from dust and to tame their odor. In the heat of midday, that smell hung over the stalls like a warning, enticing to some, nauseating to others. Preservation was crude. Salt was the main defense, drawing moisture from the curds and slowing bacterial growth. Some cheeses were submerged in jars of oil or beer, sealing them from air. Others were kept in tightly woven reed baskets, hung in the shade to dry. But all methods relied on luck and careful timing. One day too long in the sun, and the cheese could turn. For the Egyptians, this risk was worth it. Cheese offered dense nutrition, rich in fat and protein, in a form that could travel without spoiling as quickly as milk. Soldiers carried it on campaigns, traders brought it upriver, and families tucked it into baskets for long journeys. It was both food and trade commodity, passing from hand to hand like small, edible bricks of value. Still, cheese was never entirely safe. Beyond brucellosis, it could carry listeria, salmonella, or simple food poisoning. The symptoms, vomiting, fever, weakness, could be deadly in a world without medicine. Those who fell ill might blame the gods, or the ill will of spirits, never realizing the true source was the humble, creamy wedge on their plate. In temples, cheese had its place among offerings. Clay models of cheese appear in tomb scenes, set beside loaves of bread and jars of beer. Whether the gods were thought to eat it or merely enjoy its symbolism, it was a food worthy of the divine. Some scholars believe that cheese, like bread and beer, carried not only physical nourishment but spiritual protection, binding the eater to the cycles of life and death. Imagine an evening in a noble's villa, the sun sinking behind the palm groves, the courtyard glowing with oil lamps, and servants laying out the final course. On a small tray lies a wedge of pale cheese, drizzled with honey and sprinkled with crushed coriander. The guest takes a bite, tart, salty, a little earthy. It pairs perfectly with the sweet figs beside it. And yet, in that same bite, unseen and unfeared, could be the seeds of a fever that would rise days later, striking without mercy. In the ancient Egyptian mind, food and fate were always intertwined. Cheese was no different, both sustenance and risk, luxury and potential doom. It could nourish a king, sustain a soldier, or quietly betray its eater. And still, they ate it. Because in Egypt, as in life, every meal was a wager against time, the sun, and the invisible world hidden inside the foods they loved. If bread was the body of Egypt, beer was its lifeblood. It was not merely a drink, it was wages, medicine, an offering to the gods, and the safest source of hydration in a land where the Nile could not always be trusted. But like all Egyptian staples, it had its dangers. Beer in the ancient world could nourish you, or end you. To the Egyptians, beer, henket, was as essential as air. Workers who carved the tombs of the Valley of the Kings were paid in daily rations of bread and beer, sometimes as much as 4 liters per day for a laborer. It was thick, cloudy, and far from the golden liquid in modern pint glasses. More like a fermented porridge than a drink, it was made from half-baked loaves of barley bread crumbled into water, left to ferment naturally. Strained through baskets of reeds, the result was a foamy, yeasty brew, heavy with grain solids. This beer was nutritious, full of carbohydrates, vitamins from the yeast, and a gentle buzz from its alcohol content. It was safe, too, or so they thought, because the fermentation process killed much of the harmful bacteria found in untreated water. But safety was never guaranteed. If the brew fermented too long, it could become sour and harsh, tasting more like vinegar than beer. Worse still, without careful brewing, wild molds could contaminate it. Some of these molds produced mycotoxins, poisons invisible to the eye but devastating to the body. A contaminated batch could cause nausea, dizziness, or even long-term liver damage. And then there was ergot. The same fungus that occasionally infested rye in later European history could infect barley as well. Drinking beer brewed from ergot-infected grain could lead to violent convulsions, hallucinations, or gangrene in the limbs. For the Egyptians, such symptoms might be blamed on curses or divine punishment, but in truth, they were sipping their way toward illness. Still, beer was so woven into Egyptian life that to go without it was unthinkable. The gods themselves were said to have enjoyed it, most famously Hathor, the goddess of love and joy. In one myth, Ra, angered by humanity's rebellion, sent Hathor in her destructive aspect as Sekhmet to slaughter mankind. She killed without mercy until the Nile ran red with blood. To stop her, Ra ordered beer to be dyed with red ochre and poured over the fields. Mistaking it for blood, Sekhmet drank deeply, became drunk, and fell asleep, thus sparing humanity. Ever after, beer was offered to her in temples as both a tribute and a reminder of mercy. At festivals, beer flowed freely, sometimes in quantities that left whole crowds swaying and singing under the open sky. For many, drunkenness was not just tolerated but celebrated. It was seen as a way to reach a divine state of joy, to loosen the boundaries between mortals and gods. But outside the joy of celebration, beer could also be a tool of control. Grain and beer rations tied workers to the state, making them dependent on the pharaoh's stores. In times of famine, withholding beer could spark unrest. Records from the workmen's village of Deir el-Medina describe strikes when beer deliveries were delayed, proof that in Egypt, beer was not just drink, but leverage. Brewing was largely the domain of women, both in households and in large-scale production facilities attached to temples or estates. Skilled brewers knew the subtle signs of a healthy ferment, the color of the foam, the smell rising from the jars, the sound of bubbles breaking at the surface. But even the most careful brewer could not always control the unpredictable dance of yeast, bacteria, and grain. Imagine standing in a brewery in ancient Thebes, rows of tall ceramic jars, some steaming from freshly mixed mash, others cool and frothy with fermentation. The air is thick with the smell of bread and yeast, the floor sticky underfoot. A brewer ladles a cloudy, amber liquid into a cup, warm, grainy, and alive with flavor. You drink, feeling the heavy sweetness coat your tongue, unaware of whether this batch will leave you pleasantly tipsy or gripping your stomach by nightfall. Beer was, in many ways, the perfect symbol of Egyptian life, born from the land, tied to the rhythms of the Nile, sustaining yet dangerous, divine yet common. It was the drink of kings and farmers alike, a bond between the living and the gods, a reward for labor, and sometimes, quietly, invisibly, a sentence. The Egyptians drank it anyway. Because in their world, as in ours, risk and pleasure often come from the same cup. If beer and bread were the staples of Egyptian life, then honey was its luxury, golden, fragrant, and coveted enough to be stored like treasure in sealed jars alongside a noble's jewelry. But even the sweetest gift nature offered could turn dark in the desert heat, becoming a strange blend of delicacy and danger. Honey in ancient Egypt was more than food. It was medicine, offering, and even currency. The Egyptians kept bees in woven straw hives, carefully placed near fields of clover and lotus, so the bees could collect nectar rich in flavor. The honey was thick, slightly darker than what we might buy today, with a taste that could change from floral to earthy depending on the season. It was given to the gods in temples, used to sweeten bread and beer, and fed to pharaohs on their journey through the afterlife. In medical papyri, honey appears again and again, not as a treat, but as a healing agent. Its antibacterial properties made it ideal for treating wounds, burns, and eye infections. Physicians mixed it with herbs to create salves and with animal fat to make ointments. Honey was, quite literally, the taste of health. Yet, the very thing that made it precious, its sugar content, also made it volatile. In the Egyptian climate, improperly stored honey could ferment. In small amounts, this fermentation created mead, a lightly alcoholic drink. But left unchecked, it could sour into something unpleasant, sharp, and almost medicinal in its bitterness. Worse, honey could crystallize into hard lumps or attract insects and rodents. Milk, too, was a food of contradictions. Cows, goats, and sheep were kept for milk, but unlike honey, milk was never truly safe in the Egyptian heat. Without refrigeration, fresh milk spoiled within hours. It curdled into sour milk quickly, developing a sharp tang that some Egyptians enjoyed, similar to yogurt, but if the milk carried harmful bacteria like Brucella or Salmonella, souring only concentrated the danger. Still, milk had its place. Goat's milk was often fed to children, mixed with honey to make it sweeter. Cow's milk was offered in rituals, especially to Hathor, who was depicted as a nurturing cow goddess. Sour milk was sometimes used medicinally, prescribed for stomach troubles or skin conditions. In rare cases, milk was curdled intentionally to make soft cheeses, but evidence suggests cheese was far less common in Egypt than in later Mediterranean cultures. One of the strangest and most unsettling uses of honey and milk was in preservation, not of food, but of the dead. Some accounts from later periods describe bodies being embalmed or stored in honey to slow decay. Whether these were ritual practices or rare accidents of history, the idea is chilling, the sweetness of honey encasing the silence of death. The famous tale of Alexander the Great's body being transported in a coffin filled with honey centuries later has echoes in Egyptian tradition. While Egypt's embalmers perfected mummification with natron salts, honey's natural preservation qualities may have been an occasional, if costly, supplement. The wealthy could afford such extravagance, the poor could only dream of dying in sweetness instead of rot. Even in daily life, honey and milk were symbols of abundance, associated with the Nile's bounty and the favor of the gods. Yet they were also reminders of how quickly beauty could decay. A jar of honey left unsealed might fill with ants. A jug of milk left in the sun might curdle into something foul. In the Egyptian mind, this was not just bad luck, it was the natural order, the balance between life and spoilage, sweetness and corruption. Imagine, then, a banquet in Thebes, silver bowls of honey glint in the torchlight, fresh milk poured into small alabaster cups, loaves dipped into the golden liquid, and figs glistening under its glaze. Guests murmur in pleasure, unaware that by dawn, the milk will sour and the honey may begin to ferment. The sweetness of the night will not last. For the Egyptians, this was not a flaw, it was a truth they understood intimately. All things, no matter how sweet, would eventually turn. If the Egyptian table could offer sweetness, it could also serve decay, sometimes by choice. To the modern tongue, the idea of willingly eating rotting fish or meat sounds like desperation, but for the ancient Egyptians, fermentation and controlled rot were part of their culinary logic. In a land of extremes, where the sun could both bless and destroy, they had learned to use it as both a friend and a tool. The Nile was a ribbon of life, its waters teeming with fish, Nile perch, catfish, tilapia. Fresh catches could be grilled, stewed, or boiled, but preserving fish meant survival, and the most common method was salting and sun-drying. This process often created something between fresh and rotten, fish whose flesh softened and darkened, with a smell sharp enough to announce itself long before it reached the mouth. Archaeological finds reveal entire jars of preserved fish, sometimes coated in a crust of salt, sometimes steeped in pungent brine. If kept too long, this preservation tipped into fermentation. The resulting product could be rich and savory, like the fasik still eaten in Egypt today during the spring festival of Shem el-Nessim, or dangerously toxic if the wrong bacteria took hold. Botulism, a lethal neurotoxin, could lurk unseen in a jar sealed against air. Meat was trickier still. Egyptians prized beef, lamb, and goose, but without cold storage, fresh meat spoiled quickly. To delay this, it was salted, dried, or smoked, but sometimes intentionally left to age until it developed an intense, almost gamey flavor. Goose and duck, in particular, were sometimes stored in jars of fat, where they fermented slowly, taking on a tang that modern palates might find repulsive. Some sources suggest that wealthier Egyptians occasionally indulged in delicacies that were borderline spoiled, believing that fermentation deepened flavor. This practice was not unique. Romans would later adore garum, a sauce of rotting fish guts, and many cultures prized aged meats, but it came with clear risks. A bad cut of meat could leave even the noblest diner doubled over with cramps. And yet, the line between dangerous and desirable was often blurred. In the Egyptian worldview, strong, pungent flavors were a sign of potency. Foods that made the eyes water and the tongue tingle were thought to invigorate the body. The smell was not a warning, it was part of the allure. There's a papyrus recipe for what might have been a proto-fish sauce, small fish or fish parts packed in layers with salt and left in the sun until they liquefied into a powerful condiment. Such a sauce would have been drizzled over bread or vegetables, adding a deep umami punch to otherwise plain meals. To the Egyptian nose, its stench was the smell of richness. But spoilage could never be fully controlled. In lean times, the temptation to eat past prime fish or meat could lead to outbreaks of food poisoning. The symptoms, vomiting, diarrhea, fever, might be blamed on the wrath of a god, a curse, or even malevolent spirits. In reality, the culprit was far more mundane, bacteria thriving in the warm, fertile air. Imagine a fisherman's stall in a bustling riverside market, strings of drying fish swaying in the heat, the air heavy with salt and a sour tang, flies buzzing lazily over the stalls. A woman haggles for a slab of preserved catfish, its edges blackened by the sun. She takes it home, pounds it with herbs, and serves it to her family. They eat, savoring the sharpness, never knowing whether this meal will be a feast or a test of the stomach's strength. In Egypt, decay was not simply avoided, it was harnessed. The same sun that ripened figs and warmed honey also deepened the flavors of meat and fish. But it was a dangerous ally. In their pursuit of sustenance and flavor, the Egyptians accepted that every bite carried a shadow of risk. And perhaps, for them, that risk was part of the taste. Bread in ancient Egypt was life. It was not merely a staple, it was currency, offering, and symbol. Workers on the great building projects were often paid in bread and beer, priests received loaves as part of their temple rations, and the dead were buried with carefully shaped rolls to nourish them in the afterlife. But bread, as essential as it was, could also be treacherous. The ancient Egyptian loaf was nothing like the soft, airy bread of modern bakeries. It was dense, heavy, and often gritty, literally. The process began with grinding grain, usually emmer wheat or barley, between two stones. This method inevitably scraped particles of quartz and sandstone into the flour. Over time, eating such bread wore down teeth, grinding them to stumps, leaving exposed nerves and causing constant pain. Many mummies, even of the wealthy, showed teeth worn almost flat, with abscesses and infections that could be fatal. But there was another danger lurking in those loaves: mold. Stored grain was vulnerable to moisture, and once spoiled, it could carry ergot, a toxic fungus. Consuming ergot-contaminated bread could cause violent convulsions, hallucinations, or even death. The symptoms, trembling limbs, visions, and burning sensations, might have seemed like the touch of a god or the curse of an enemy. In reality, it was poison hidden in the daily bread. Celebration breads and cakes were no safer. For festivals, Egyptians made special loaves sweetened with honey or dates, sometimes shaped like animals or decorated with nuts and seeds. These were offered to the gods before being eaten by the living. But the ingredients, especially fruit, could spoil quickly in the heat, turning the treat into a breeding ground for bacteria. One festival, dedicated to Hathor, the goddess of love and joy, featured copious amounts of sweet bread, beer, and music. It is not hard to imagine the morning after, bellies aching from overindulgence, headaches pounding from both beer and food poisoning. In the Egyptian mind, this was part of the divine revelry, a sacrifice of the body to honor the gods. Bread also played a role in magical and medicinal practices. Some spells required loaves mixed with unusual ingredients, herbs, oils, even animal fats. These concoctions, eaten as charms or remedies, might have been effective or might have been toxic. A medicinal cake intended to purge illness could just as easily purge life itself. In the great bakeries of the temples, where hundreds of loaves were baked daily, the air would have been thick with heat and dust. Workers kneaded dough with their feet in large troughs, a process both efficient and unhygienic. The finished bread was baked in clay molds, which sometimes left charred residue clinging to the crust. A loaf could be burnt on the outside and undercooked within, its warm, damp core an ideal home for bacteria. Yet bread remained sacred. No offering to the gods was complete without it. Even in tomb paintings, the deceased are shown receiving endless platters of bread from the afterlife servants. The danger was part of the reality of life in Egypt. The same loaf that sustained could also destroy. Picture a harvest feast in the courtyard of a wealthy Theban household, tables laden with honey cakes shaped like ducks, flatbread stacked in pyramids, golden loaves still warm from the oven. Children run between the tables, stealing bites, priests murmur blessings, musicians play in the background. The smell is intoxicating. And yet, hidden in those loaves, grit grinds between teeth, mold spores lurk unseen, and the sweetness masks the first faint hint of sourness. In Egypt, bread was not just food, it was fate, baked into a crust. And fate, like bread, could be both a blessing and a curse. If bread was the body of ancient Egypt, beer was its blood. Thick, sweet, and nourishing, it was drunk by everyone, pharaohs, peasants, priests, and even children. Beer was sustenance, a daily ration, and a centerpiece of feasts and festivals. But for all its place in Egyptian life, the beloved brew could also be a silent killer. The beer of the Nile was nothing like the crisp, golden drink of modern pubs. It was more like a porridge you could sip, a cloudy, frothy liquid made by fermenting crumbled bread loaves with water and dates. Often unfiltered, it contained chunks of grain and yeast, giving it a hearty, almost chewy texture. It was rich in calories, a meal in a cup. But it also carried hidden dangers. First, there was contamination. The brewing process relied on open vessels, exposed to the air and to whatever insects, dirt, or spores drifted in from the bustling streets or the muddy riverbanks. A jar left too long in the sun might develop a sour, unpleasant tang, or worse, harbor dangerous bacteria. Infected beer could cause violent stomach illness, sometimes spreading through whole work crews or households. Then there was the risk from the water itself. The Nile was the source of life, but it was also a carrier of disease. Brewing beer could reduce some dangers, as the alcohol content and fermentation helped kill harmful microbes, but not always. In times of drought, when river levels dropped and water grew stagnant, beer made from contaminated sources could sicken entire communities. But perhaps the strangest and most feared risk came from the brewing vessels. Some jars, particularly in wealthier households, were glazed or decorated with minerals that contained lead. Over time, lead could leach into the beer, poisoning those who drank it regularly. Chronic lead exposure could cause headaches, stomach pain, nerve damage, and even blindness. The symptoms were often mysterious to the Egyptians, attributed to curses or divine punishment, but the real culprit was the very drink they adored. Beer also played a role in religious ritual, sometimes with dangerous consequences. During the annual festival of drunkenness in honor of Hathor and Sekhmet, people drank to excess, sometimes collapsing in the streets or drowning in the Nile after stumbling home. The mythology behind the festival was itself a warning wrapped in celebration. In one myth, the goddess Sekhmet nearly destroyed humanity in a bloodlust, but was calmed when she drank vats of beer dyed red to resemble blood. The festival commemorated this by encouraging the same intoxicating excess, ironically, a practice that could itself lead to injury or death. Still, beer was too central to abandon. For the average Egyptian laborer, it was part of the daily wage, thick, nourishing, and safer than raw water, at least most of the time. To go without it would be unthinkable. Even the dead were buried with jars of beer to enjoy in the afterlife, just as they were buried with bread. Imagine a brewer's courtyard along the Nile, huge ceramic vats set out in the sun, the air rich with the smell of yeast and fermenting grain. Women stir the bubbling mixture with long wooden paddles, their arms dusted with flour. Children run between the vats, splashing water, while flies circle lazily above. In one corner, a jar over-ferments, its contents foaming and souring in the heat. Later that night, its beer will be ladled into cups at a feast, its bitterness masked with dates and honey, its danger invisible until the sickness comes. In Egypt, beer was a blessing. But blessings, as the ancients knew, always carried a shadow. For most ancient Egyptians, meat was a rare treat. Daily meals were simple: bread, beer, onions, beans, so when meat appeared on the table, it was a sign of celebration or privilege. Festivals, sacrifices, or the generosity of a wealthy patron might bring roasted duck, grilled beef, or stewed goat to the table. Along the Nile, fish was more common, caught fresh from the river or dried in the sun. But the luxury of meat and fish carried risks that could be as deadly as they were delicious. One of the greatest hazards came from preservation, or rather, the lack of it. Egypt's heat was relentless. Without refrigeration, fresh meat had only hours before it began to spoil. Butchers worked quickly, cutting and distributing meat before the sun could turn it. Even so, flies swarmed over stalls, laying eggs on cuts of flesh. If the meat was not eaten quickly or properly cooked, it became a breeding ground for bacteria that could cause fevers, vomiting, or worse. We know from tomb paintings and temple reliefs that meat was often eaten grilled or roasted, sometimes with visible pink at the center, attempting undercooking in a world without knowledge of pathogens. River fish, gutted and dried in the sun, might carry parasites invisible to the eye. In the mummified remains of ancient Egyptians, scientists have found evidence of tapeworms and other intestinal parasites, unwanted guests that likely came from undercooked or poorly dried fish. There was also a more insidious risk. Some fish species in the Nile, such as certain types of catfish, were known to feed in stagnant, polluted waters. They could accumulate toxins or harmful bacteria from the riverbed. Eating such fish might cause stomach distress or long-term illness, though the connection was invisible to ancient diners. Cultural beliefs shaped what was considered safe. The Nile perch and mullet were favored delicacies, while other species were avoided entirely, not because of spoilage risks, but due to religious taboos. The priests of some temples, for example, would not touch fish at all, believing them ritually unclean. Ironically, these taboos may have spared them from the illnesses that afflicted others. Meat offered its own spectrum of dangers. Beef and mutton for festivals were often slaughtered in open courtyards, with the process recorded by scribes for temple accounts. After slaughter, the carcass might hang in the heat before being butchered, attracting flies and dust. Salt curing was known but not widely practiced. Instead, meat for later use was dried or smoked, methods that slowed spoilage but did not eliminate bacteria. Insects could still burrow into drying strips of flesh, and mold could grow on smoked meat in humid weather. Even the most sumptuous feast could turn deadly. Imagine a banquet in the palace of a noble, the air filled with the smell of roasting duck stuffed with dates, platters of grilled fish gleaming with oil, skewers of mutton sizzling over coals. Servants rush to refill cups of beer, musicians play flutes, and guests laugh between mouthfuls. The food is rich, flavorful, unforgettable. And yet, by morning, the laughter is replaced by groans, bellies clench in agony, the banquet remembered not for its joy, but for the sickness it brought. For the ancient Egyptians, the risks of meat and fish were the price of rare indulgence. A taste of luxury could feed the body, or summon the shadow of death. In a land where life and death were constantly entwined, such dangers were accepted as part of the feast. Sugar, as we know it today, did not exist in ancient Egypt. Sweetness came from honey, dates, figs, and occasionally syrups made from boiled fruit or tree sap. For the wealthy, these treats were a luxury to be savored; for commoners, they were rare and precious. But sweetness in the ancient world carried risks far beyond the toothaches it caused. Honey, though naturally antibacterial when pure, was not always pure. In the bustling markets of Thebes or Memphis, jars of honey were often adulterated with date syrup to stretch supplies. These diluted mixtures could ferment if left in the heat, turning the prized sweetener into a bubbling, sour-smelling liquid. Worse still, some unscrupulous sellers mixed in gritty sand or powdered stone to increase weight, a deceit that wore down teeth and damaged gums over time. Dates and figs, staples of the Egyptian sweet tooth, were sun-dried to preserve them. But drying was a delicate art; too much moisture left in the fruit, and mold would grow; too much exposure to dust and flies, and insects laid their eggs within. Biting into a worm-filled date was an unpleasant surprise, but the real danger came from invisible mold toxins, which could cause stomach sickness or, over time, organ damage. We have archaeological evidence of such spoilage: desiccated figs and dates found in tomb offerings, their surfaces blackened with fungal growth after thousands of years. If such contamination occurred in the dry, protected tomb environment, it's easy to imagine how quickly it happened in the bustling markets of the living. Even cakes and pastries, made from bread dough mixed with honey or fruit, could be perilous. Without preservatives, their moist interiors turned sour in just a day. Leftover festival cakes, offered to guests a day too late, might deliver more than just sweetness; they could be the carriers of a quiet, creeping illness. Yet, despite the dangers, sweet foods remained symbols of joy and devotion. In temples, priests offered honey cakes to the gods, believing sweetness pleased divine palates. In homes, mothers gave their children dates as treats, even if it meant risking a bellyache. The lure of sweetness, then as now, was irresistible, and perhaps worth the gamble. If one thread runs through the foods of ancient Egypt, it is this: every meal was both a blessing and a gamble. Bread might feed you, or choke you with grit. Beer could quench your thirst, or leave you blind. Meat and fish promised feasts of joy, yet could seed the body with parasites. Even honey cakes, symbols of love and piety, could turn against their makers. And yet, the Egyptians thrived for millennia. Part of this resilience came from adaptation. They learned which fish to avoid, which herbs might ease the stomach after bad beer, which breads to soak in broth to soften their stone-hard crusts. They celebrated food not just for its taste, but for its role in the eternal cycle of life, death, and rebirth. In their art, food was always present, painted in tombs, carved into temple walls, listed in hieroglyphic offerings to the gods. To the ancient Egyptian mind, food was not merely sustenance; it was a bridge between the mortal and the divine. The risks it carried were accepted as part of living in a world where life itself was never guaranteed. Imagine the banks of the Nile at sunset, fishermen hauling in nets heavy with gleaming silver bodies, bakers pulling loaves from dome-shaped ovens, their crusts blackened by the fire, brewers stirring thick, yeasty beer in sunlit courtyards, market women arranging piles of dates and onions under the watchful gaze of temple pylons. This was Egypt's table, abundant, fragrant, alive. But in every basket, jar, and pot lurked unseen dangers. The ancient Egyptians did not see their food as strange or horrific. To them, it was life itself, a daily gift of the gods, worth every risk. It is only through the lens of modern knowledge that we see the hazards, the invisible killers, the microbial shadows cast over each meal. And perhaps that is the most haunting truth. For all our advances, our food today still carries its own unseen dangers. We may no longer fear beer that blinds us or bread full of sand, but the dance between hunger, pleasure, and peril is as old as civilization itself. In the end, the ancient Egyptian table was a place of both joy and death, where every bite was a reminder that to live is always to take a risk.